But before I get to that, we haven't been able to talk to you since the passing of Bob Knight. You are someone who has been around and was around for a long time. People from IU, they're going to give their side, and his coaching genius, it cannot be denied. His success, it cannot be denied. The things he accomplished cannot be denied. We all know that he had his demons and whatnot, but he was just a gigantic shadow, and I don't mean that in a bad way, in a good way, over college basketball because of his there are icons and there are icons, and he is an icon of a sport and of sports in general. There's not many coaches that you would see being brought on to David Letterman and things like that. Bob Knight was. There's not many coaches that you would see were in movies. Bob Knight was in Anger Management, of course, and Blue Chips, but appropriately, the clip in Anger Management is awesome. But just because of who he was, and he was a very I'm losing the word I'm looking for, but he was a very enigmatic figure.
Oh, he certainly was. It's hard to understand why he chose some of the courses that he chose when he was so obviously brilliant and so obviously accomplished. It's hard to say why he chose at times to be unkind in certain circumstances. But he certainly was, and he was an enormous figure. He was iconic. And you talked about Blue Chips, a movie that I really loathed, by the way. But one of the many things I loathed about it was that in choosing, in designing the character of the coach, Nick Nolte decides to copy the iconic coach and not the typical coach. You know what I mean? Like, wears the sweater and all that. How many coaches were wearing sweaters in 1994, 95? One guy. So why would you do that? That's one of the reasons I didn't like the movie. But if you're going to copy one, you're going to copy the most distinctive character, I guess. And that was obviously Bob. There was no one like him. There's never going to be another like him. There's never going to be another who comports himself like Bob, or who maybe never another who coaches at the level that he does. When I was on Big Ten Network the night of Bob's passing with Mike Hall, and Mike Hall brought up a stat that he thought kind of defined what Bob was as a coach, and I think it's a great one. But I thought I had a better one. His defining stat was the fact that in all his years at Indiana, and for winning more games to the point of his retirement of any coach in men's basketball history, he only produced one NBA All-Star. So he'd only had one NBA All-Star at his disposal, so to speak. But I think that even better stat to define who Bob was as a coach is the fact that since 1987, how many tournaments is that? Like 35, 36, somewhere in there. It's not as easy to do the math because of 2020 as it would, because we didn't have a tournament that year. But it's 35, 36, 37 tournaments, something like that. And since Bob won the NCAA championship in 87 with no NBA first-round picks in his rotation, that has not happened one time since. Mike Krzyzewski didn't do it. John Calipari didn't do it. Bill Self didn't do it. Jay Wright didn't do it. All the coaches who've won since have had one or more, usually more, first-round picks in their rotation. Bob had an all-time great college player in Steve Alford, who was not a first-round pick in the NBA and didn't play a long career in the NBA. He had Dean Garrett, who was a second-rounder and had and lasted in the league, but was never a hugely impactful player. I mean, he wasn't a star, let's say. He was a very good NBA player, but he wasn't changing teams. And that was all on the 87 team. No one else was, Keith Smart played a little while, but not a long while in the NBA. But no one else could do what he did. And I remember feeling bad for Pat Knight when Bob decided partway through, I think it was 2008, that he'd had enough and it was time to step aside and Pat would take over. And I'm like, here's the problem with that. Only Bob can win with those players. Bob can do it. No one else can. And now you're asking a guy who's had minimal coaching experience, head coaching experience, to win with Bob Knight's players. I mean, that's like handing me an unfinished work by Hemingway and say, go ahead, you finish it. I mean, I can write, but not like that.
Analogy. What a great analogy that was right there. Holy cow. Man, you got to write that one down. If you haven't used that one already, that's a little piece of gold right there. Yeah, it was. And the motion offense, I don't want to say it's gone away, but it's basically gone away. And I've heard, because a lot of people say, well, nobody could teach it like he could. And he was a genius. He was a genius.
I don't have any problem with that descriptor.
Just his people that are able to just do things in certain areas. It's mind-boggling. There's no doubt. You can look through the annals of sports, and there are people that are just great coaches. And if you don't think coaching makes a difference, you're nuts. Bob Knight's a perfect example of that.
I think Mike Krzyzewski is the greatest coach in college basketball history because of what he constructed and the period that he constructed it over, the length. Final Four in '86, Final Four in 2012. I mean, that's basically almost my entire lifetime, or certainly my career span. But they used to have this thing when I was younger called IROC. It was
International Racing
Champions. And the idea was to take the car out of it, so to speak. Everybody has the same car, and let's see who's the best driver. Well, you can't really do that in any sport. But for me, like if you had an IROC basketball coaching, like everybody somehow had the same 5 players or the same 7 players or whatever. The guys, to me, who would be at the front of the line when the race was over are Bob Knight, Larry Brown, and Rick Pitino. They're the old Bum Phillips thing. They can take urine and beat his in. That to me, those are the guys that are the best at that. At taking that, they all had different flaws and therefore different results. I mean, Larry's constant movement, Rick Pitino's up and down, circumstances, and then Bob's, his what we talked about before, the
motion
temper,
offense,
if you want to call it
that.
But they all had that ability to take whatever you gave them, they were going to make it the best it could possibly be. And I think that, Bob, we can argue about which one would be the best. I mean, Larry has the advantage of having done it with among the most improbable lineups at the NCAA and NBA level. I mean, his 2004 Pistons championship team isn't like any of the last 30. The Kansas team, Danny, okay, all-time great, but then there were the miracles, not all-time greats. And then you have Bob with that 87 team, which, again, Steve Alford was an amazing college player. When I wrote my book on the Legends of College Basketball and the top 100 players, he was in the top 40. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but he was in the top 40. Because he was that great. But who else do you remember for that team? I mean, the names because you're an IU person. I know the names because it was my first Final Four.
Steve Isle.
Steve Isle's one of my faves.
Rick Calloway was a starter that did not score a point in the national championship game. I think I've got to go back. I'd have to pull it up real quick. I think, if I could be wrong, maybe only 4 players scored in that game for Indiana.
Wow.
Is that possible?
That's easy to figure out, but I did not know that.
John, pull that up instead of making us do that. But I think I remember Ricky Callaway not scoring in that game. If it wasn't that game, it was one of the others leading up to it. But that was the system at work. I mean, Steve Alford's going to take the shots.
Yes,
He's smart as a secondary. You've got Dean Garrett and Daryl Thomas besides Ricky Callaway.
You're right. Ricky, only 4 players scored. You're right. Ricky did not score. Joe Hillman off the bench. Steve Isle played 13 minutes, set a bunch of screens, did not score. Todd Meyer and Craig Smith. That's it. That was the whole group.
That has ever happened before. I mean, I'm sure it could have happened before, but there is no damn way in Hades that has ever happened since and will happen again. I can't imagine.
Yes. And it's just, like I said, it just shows what Bob was capable of doing as a coach. There was no one like him, and there were very few at his level.
I don't know why I always do this, but it's just fun. I always play this over and over. I can't hear it right now, but this is just I play this every time that I have Brian Evans on. Oh, I missed it. That was geared towards Brian Evans. Not every time Brian's on. I just love that. It's just he's sitting there all calm, but he sees something, and this was on the other end that was going on, and yeah, it was just crazy. But I'm able to compartmentalize the greatness, the success, the demons. Hey, I know that he was that he had this side to him, and I know a lot of things that most fans don't, but there's also a lot of things that I still don't know, and I know that. But I'm able to compartmentalize his coaching, his success, his demons. You know, I can put the person that he was to a side. He had things that he did that were great that people don't know about.
Yes,
and that's a thing that is left out of there. But just the icon that basketball lost, and the worst thing is, it sucks on how it played out, on how he was not able. Good thing, it's grateful that he was able to come back.
Yes,
but that should have happened long before. When you do what he did,
people tried, Jim. People tried.
I know. It was on. He was just too stubborn. He would not relent, and it's a shame because, man, he deserved that. He took that away from himself.
He did, but I tend to look at it more from the positive that it did happen, and he got to have that afternoon. Although it would have helped if the Hoosiers won that game, but he got to have that afternoon, and everybody was there. I mean, everybody came that could come. Among his former players, everyone that could come and wanted to be a part of that was able to do that.
I mean, Mark Cuban came in for this.
Yeah,
Sage Steele was there. This was a major deal for him coming.
But for me, it was more about Isaiah was there, and I remember I was in Bloomington for a celebration. I believe it was the '91 champs. I can't remember what anniversary it would have been. It would have been since I moved here, so I'm pretty sure it was the '91 champs. It could have, it could have been the '87 champs, maybe 30 years out. Maybe that's what it was. But I remembered being there and writing that Bob should have been there, and he should have been, that he needed to be there, and the players talked about how they wished he was there, and so I'm glad that instead of us sitting here saying, "Boy, that never happened," it did. That afternoon in 2020, with everybody giving him a standing ovation and him being able to engage with the crowd. I think it was a blessing. I'm glad he had that moment. I'm glad IU basketball had that moment, and IU fandom had that moment. And I think between that and Mike Woodson being hired, a lot of what held back Indiana basketball for basically 20 years was erased. I think that I think there were there were mistakes made and games that weren't won by Coach Crean and Coach Miller, and obviously I think that Kelvin Sampson is one of the great coaches in college basketball, but hiring him in 2006 with an open investigation at Oklahoma was not the right move for Indiana. It was a totally tone deaf move by the administration. But all those coaches, they were held back to some degree, and Mike Davis certainly most foremost, because he was the one who followed immediately, by the anger.
How hard was that? How hard was that?
Yeah, they were all held back to some degree by the anger and resentment of a portion of the fan base toward the dismissal of Bob. And I think that afternoon in 2020, and then now the hiring of Mike Woodson as one of his successors has removed that element. I think IU basketball now succeeds or fails on the basis of the people involved, and I think it has basically a full, it has a clean slate, and I think we're seeing that clean slate has helped. It's gotten them, it's helped them get into the tournament the last 2 years. It's helped them recruit at a really high level, both in the high school ranks and in the transfer portal. And we'll see whether it is able to propel them back toward the position on the national stage that the fan base longs to occupy.